On a mild June afternoon, the village of Little Bracknell glowed with the kind of sunlight that encouraged even the most reclusive of neighbors to step outside and mingle. Mrs. Harriet Compton's annual summer garden party, spoken of with alternating reverence and dread, had drawn an impressive gathering this year. Her roses, which she insisted were the envy of all Hampshire, stood in obedient rows along the lawn, nodding their crimson heads at the guests who passed with glasses of elderflower cordial or more daring helpings of gin punch. Miss Jane Marple, seated neatly in the shade of a white parasol, observed the affair with gentle fondness. She wore a pale blue dress and a small hat trimmed with a sprig of lavender, simple, practical, and entirely overshadowed by the flamboyance of Mrs. Compton's attire. Harriet Compton adored spectacle, and today she shimmered in taffeta, ensuring she would catch both the sunlight and the attention of every soul present. "A delightful turnout, isn't it, Miss Marple?" murmured Reverend Chillingworth, leaning on his cane beside her. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied with a small smile. "Village events do make people behave in the most revealing of ways." The Reverend, uncertain whether this was a criticism or merely an observation, nodded politely and moved on to greet a group of parishioners. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently. She found it soothing, and it allowed her to watch without appearing to do so. Today, she noted the nervous energy in young Emily Harper, who kept glancing toward the garden gate. The sour expression of Mr. Lionel Briggs, always displeased unless he had a complaint to voice, and the exaggerated cheerfulness of Dr. Bernard Littleton, who laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. The dynamics of a village, Miss Marple often thought, could be charted as neatly as the rows of Mrs. Compton's rose bushes. But it was Mrs. Compton herself who bustled toward Miss Marple now, flustered and breathless, a most unusual state for a woman who prided herself on immaculate control. "Miss Marple, dear, just a moment, if you please," she exclaimed, wobbling slightly on her heels. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Of course, Harriet. Are you quite well?" Mrs. Compton dabbed her forehead with a lace-edged handkerchief. "I fear a little. Complication has arisen. Nothing serious, I'm sure, but... Oh, Jane, it's so dreadfully awkward." "Awkward?" Miss Marple's brow lifted just enough to suggest interest, not alarm. It's the quiet room," Mrs. Compton whispered. The quiet room was a small cottage annex at the edge of Mrs. Compton's grounds, historically used for rest, reflection, and refined conversation, though in recent years it had served more commonly as a storage space for party supplies. It was not unusual for guests to slip in there if they needed a moment away from the clamor of the party. "I asked Daphne to fetch the extra napkins," Harriet continued, "and she found someone inside." "A guest who lost their way," Miss Marple suggested gently. Mrs. Compton shook her head, her eyes widening. "A stranger." That caught Miss Marple's attention. Strangers were rarities in Little Bracknell. "He is lying on the floor," Mrs. Compton whispered. "Quite still." Miss Marple rose instantly. "Show me." They crossed the garden discreetly, avoiding the clusters of guests drawn to the refreshments table. Mrs. Compton led her along a gravel path, their footsteps crunching softly. When they reached the quiet room, a whitewashed building with a thatched roof and a blue-painted door, Miss Marple noticed at once that the stillness around it felt heavier than the warmth of the day. Daphne Fielding, Mrs. Compton's maid-of-all-work, stood outside the door twisting her apron in her hands. Her face was blotchy, her eyes swollen with tears. "I didn't touch him, Miss Marple," she stammered. "I swear I didn't." "I'm sure you didn't, my dear," Miss Marple soothed. "May I go inside?" Daphne nodded vigorously. Miss Marple stepped into the quiet room. Though the curtains had been drawn half shut, enough afternoon light filtered in for her to see clearly. A table stood against the far wall, its surface neatly set with unused napkins and a porcelain pitcher. A few chairs lined the edges of the room, but it was the figure on the carpet that captured her full attention. A man, middle-aged, dressed in a well-tailored grey suit, lay on his back, one arm flung awkwardly outward, his head turned at an unnatural angle. His shoes were polished, his cufflinks gleamed faintly, and a faint scent of citrus cologne lingered in the stagnant air. Miss Marple moved quietly, carefully, her expression thoughtful rather than shocked. She crouched, slowly, for her joints reprimanded such movements, and studied the man without touching him. No breath stirred his chest, no tension remained in his limbs. But what struck her most was not the stillness of death, which she had seen more times than she cared to admit, but an odd detail, barely noticeable at first glance. A long, thin scratch on the inside of his wrist, almost delicate in shape, yet deliberate enough not to be accidental. A clue, perhaps, or merely an unfortunate coincidence. Do you know him?" Mrs. Compton asked from the doorway, her voice trembling. Miss Marple straightened. "No, but I suspect someone here does." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Outside, laughter drifted through the open window, bright, carefree, ignorant. Inside the quiet room, death lay in silent contrast. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "I'm afraid your garden party is about to become considerably less pleasant, Harriet." Mrs. Compton gave a faint whimper. Miss Marple looked once more at the stranger, her eyes soft yet unyieldingly perceptive. "We must notify the police, and then, I think, we must prepare ourselves for the possibility that someone among your guests knows precisely why this man is here." Mrs. Compton pressed her handkerchief to her lips, the lace trembling. "The police," she repeated faintly. Yes, of course. Oh, Jane, what will people say?" "People will say whatever they wish, dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "But it is better that they say it in the presence of proper authority, rather than without it." She stepped out into the sunlight, blinking a little as her eyes adjusted. The sound of the garden party came back all at once, a captain of cricket arguing about a boundary, the clink of glasses, the high-pitched laugh of Mrs. Pembroke as she declared that the trifle was almost as good as last year's. Life went on, just a few yards away from a dead man lying on the floor. The Reverend Chillingworth was making his way along the path toward them, his expression concerned. He had noticed, as such men always do, the disturbance of the hostess and her maid outside an incongruously quiet building. "Harriet, is something amiss?" he asked. Mrs. Compton opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Miss Marple touched her arm lightly. "Harriet is a little overwrought," she said gently. "Reverend, I'm afraid there has been an unfortunate occurrence. A man has been found in the quiet room. He is, I believe, quite dead." The Reverend's mouth fell open. "Dead? Here? At the party?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "I think we had better telephone the police at once." It was characteristic of Mrs. Compton that, even in shock, she clung to the proprieties of her status. "Use the telephone in my study, Reverend," she said, finding her voice at last. "Ask for Inspector Gale. He dealt with that dreadful business at the post office last year. Oh, do be quick." Reverend Chillingworth hurried away, his cane tapping faster than usual on the stones. Miss Marple turned to Daphne. "You have been very sensible, my dear. Now, I think you must wash your face and then bring a tray of tea to the guests. Nothing calms the nerves so much as something hot in a cup, and we mustn't alarm them unnecessarily." "They'll have to be told, surely," Mrs. Compton protested weakly. "In due course," Miss Marple agreed. "But let the police arrive first. In the meantime, we shall keep them occupied." It was a curious thing, how easily a crowd senses that something is wrong. By the time Miss Marple and Mrs. Compton returned to the lawn, a subtle change had come over the gathering, and people still talked, but their eyes wandered towards the house and the path to the quiet room. Conversations broke off as Harriet passed. Those who had been laughing too loudly a moment before found themselves unable to recall the joke. Emily Harper, pretty and pink-cheeked, intercepted them near the punch bowl. "Mrs. Compton, is everything all right?" Daphne looked frightfully upset. Mrs. Compton, caught off guard, stammered, Oh, just a little mishap with the supplies. Nothing to concern yourself with, Emily." Miss Marple noted the quick glance Emily shot toward the far edge of the garden, the one that led to the lane and the village road. She also noted how Emily's hands twisted together as if she were fighting the urge to leave. "Such a lovely day for your garden party," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "You mustn't let a small mishap spoil it, Harriet. I'm certain everyone is enjoying themselves." Behind Emily, Mr. Lionel Briggs stood with his usual look of disapproval, staring into his glass of punch as though it had personally offended him. Dr. Littleton hovered near a cluster of women, telling some story that involved much hand-waving and little substance. "Did you invite anyone from out of the village, Harriet?" Miss Marple asked, as if it had just occurred to her. "A few," Mrs. Compton answered automatically. "The vicar's cousin from Barnstable, but he wrote yesterday to say he was indisposed. Mrs. Hargreaves' niece from London was expected, but she has not come. And the Ramsays brought a friend, I believe. Why do you ask?" "Only that I noticed one or two unfamiliar hats," Miss Marple said calmly. "And of course, strangers are always so interesting." Harriet gave her a sharp look, then glanced away hurriedly, as though afraid to ask more. Daphne emerged from the house with a tray of tea and scones, cheeks still blotchy but composure restored. Miss Marple watched with approval as the maid moved between the guests, offering cups and murmuring reassurances that Mrs. Compton is just seeing to something, nothing to fret about, really. Yet fret they did. Within 10 minutes it was generally understood, through that curious alchemy of half-caught phrases and speculative imagination, that something had happened in the house. No one quite knew what, but everyone had an opinion. "I'm sure it's a burglary," Mrs. Pembroke announced to anyone who would listen. "These country houses are dreadfully vulnerable. My cousin in Kent had her silver stolen right from under her nose at Christmas." "Nonsense," Mr. Briggs snorted. "More likely a gas leak or some fool thing. Compton's always fiddling with improvements." "You can hardly have a gas leak in a thatched annex, Lionel," remarked Dr. Littleton dryly. "Do use your brain, man." Miss Marple, seated once more beneath her parasol, heard it all. She knitted serenely, her needles moving with practiced efficiency. The dead man's face hovered in her mind. The neat suit, the faint cologne, the scratch on his wrist. He had not been dressed for manual work. He looked like a man accustomed to offices, perhaps rail journeys, perhaps the occasional hotel. Not local, then. And yet he had found his way into Mrs. Compton's quiet room on the afternoon of a garden party. That suggested arrangements, at the very least, expectation. A murmur spread from the drive. Heads turned. The clatter of a motorcar door reached the lawn, followed by the purposeful tread of boots on gravel. Inspector Leonard Gale of the county police appeared at the edge of the garden, accompanied by a uniformed constable with a notebook already in hand. Gale was a solid man with shrewd eyes, the sort who gave an impression of reliability rather than brilliance. He nodded to Mrs. Compton as she hurried to greet him. "Inspector, thank you for coming so quickly," she said breathlessly. "I'm afraid there has been an incident." "So I gathered, madam," he replied. "Reverend Chillingworth gave me the broad strokes. A body in your quiet room." His gaze moved briefly over the assembled guests. Many of them looked away at once. Dr. Littleton alone stood firm, arms folded, as though the presence of officialdom were a personal challenge. "Best that we go there at once," Gale continued. "Sergeant Fellows will see that no one leaves the grounds for the moment. Routine measure, you understand." A ripple of indignant whispers followed that pronouncement. Miss Marple saw Emily Harper blanch. She took a half-step toward the gate, then visibly forced herself to remain where she was. Inspector Gale noticed too. His eyes narrowed fractionally, then shifted to Miss Marple, as if acknowledging that she also had seen it. Miss Marple offered him a small, polite nod. She joined Mrs. Compton and Gale as they walked back along the path to the quiet room. The inspector did not object to her presence. He had, in the past, found her observations perturbingly apt. Inside, and the room was just as Miss Marple had left it. Gale approached the body, his manner brisk but respectful, and knelt to examine the man's face, his pockets, his hands. "No sign of a struggle," he murmured. "No obvious wound." His fingers paused near the man's wrist. "A scratch," Miss Marple observed quietly. "On the inside. Unusual place to find one, wouldn't you say?" Gale gave her a sidelong glance. "You noticed that, did you, Miss Marple?" "One sees such things," she said mildly. "In the garden, for instance, scratches are generally on the back of the hands when one is careless among the roses. This, however, suggests something more deliberate, or at least more particular." Gale grunted, non-committal. He searched the man's jacket and produced a slim wallet, a railway ticket, and a folded letter. "A rail ticket from London," he said, more to himself than to the others. "And the name on the letter, Henry Blunt. Does that mean anything to you, Mrs. Compton?" Mrs. Compton shook her head helplessly. "No, I don't know any Henry Blunt. Not that I recall." Miss Marple said nothing. The name tickled at the recesses of her memory, not as someone she knew personally, but as one hears names in a village, mentioned perhaps in a letter or in a snippet of gossip overheard in the grocer's shop. She let the thought sit quietly in the back of her mind. "We'll need statements from all your guests," Gale said. "Who arrived when, who went where, and no one must leave until we've spoken to them." "Oh, Inspector," Harriet moaned. "They'll be dreadfully offended." "Better offended than suspected, madam," Gale replied. And Miss Marple glanced toward the window, where the garden party continued under its strange pall of curiosity and fear. Among the swaying hats and fluttering dresses, human nature was preparing itself, ready to whisper, to conceal, to speculate. And somewhere out there, she felt quite sure, was the person who had known Henry Blunt, was in the quiet room this afternoon, and who had every reason to hope he would not walk out of it again. The inspector stood, dusting his hands as he rose, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the faint rustling of leaves against the window. Miss Marple felt the weight of the silence settle, not oppressive, but expectant, as though the very walls were waiting for the next breath of revelation. Inspector Gale slipped the letter and railway ticket into an evidence envelope, nodding to his constable, who took it dutifully. "We'll need to speak to the guests at once," Gale said. "People talk more freely when they think they have nothing to hide." Miss Marple gave a small hum of agreement. "And indeed, Inspector, people say the most remarkable things when they believe no one is paying them particular attention." Gale cast her a sidelong look, half wary, half appreciative. He had learned, through earlier investigations, that Miss Marple's innocent remarks were seldom casual. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, then gestured toward the door. "Let's begin." When they returned to the garden, the atmosphere had thickened, still outwardly polite, but taut with concealed curiosity. Several guests had already clustered together in uneasy knots. Mrs. Pembroke, always eager to be the first source of dubious information, she had clearly been speculating loudly, judging by the way her listeners leaned in with equal parts horror and fascination. Inspector Gale raised his voice calmly but firmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must ask for your cooperation. A man has been found deceased on the premises. We will be speaking with each of you to establish the circumstances of the afternoon. Please remain here in the garden. No one is to leave until further notice." A gasp rippled among the guests. Emily Harper swayed slightly, gripping the back of a chair. Mr. Briggs muttered something inaudible but distinctly displeased. Dr. Littleton, surprisingly, took a sip of his wine with an air of what might have been resignation. Miss Marple watched them all. Each face, each reaction, each fleeting expression quickly masked. The people always revealed themselves in the first seconds of shock, she had found. Their defenses weren't yet in place, and today there was much to observe. Inspector Gale began calling guests aside one by one to the small writing room adjacent to Mrs. Compton's study, where he could conduct his interviews with discreet efficiency. The constable positioned himself at the gate to ensure no one slipped away. As guests waited their turn, a strange mix of anxiety and indignation simmered in the air. Miss Marple settled herself once more under her parasol, her knitting needles moving at a steady rhythm. People often forgot she was there when her hands were busy. Emily Harper was the first to drift near her, drawn perhaps by instinct or the comforting presence of someone who radiated calm. Emily's face had lost most of its earlier color, as when her soft curls trembled as she leaned close. "Miss Marple, it's horrid, isn't it?" she whispered. "A murder, here, at a garden party." "We do not yet know that it is murder," Miss Marple said gently. "Though it is quite unusual, I admit." Emily clasped her hands tightly. "I keep thinking, what if he came for someone? What if he meant to meet someone here?" "That thought has occurred to others, I'm sure," Miss Marple said. "But for now, my dear, perhaps it is best to say nothing more than you are certain of. The inspector will want clarity." Emily nodded, though her eyes flickered again toward the gate where the constable stood. Then, seeming to realize she was drawing attention, she excused herself and joined a group of friends who welcomed her with hushed concern. Miss Marple's attention shifted just in time to see Dr. Littleton approach with his usual combination of confidence and slight impatience. He gave her a stiff nod. "Quite the debacle, Miss Marple. Harriet's parties never lacked excitement, but this is rather excessive." "One hopes it is not excitement of the wrong sort," she replied pleasantly. "You seemed unfazed by the inspector's announcement." "I am a doctor," he reminded her. "I've seen my share of unhappy ends. A man who dies suddenly, well, there could be any number of medical explanations." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "and yet you did not offer to examine him." Dr. Littleton paused. "It is hardly my place to interfere with official inquiries." "A commendable respect for boundaries," Miss Marple replied mildly, her needles clicking on. And he gave her a sharp look, but said nothing further before being summoned by the inspector for questioning. One by one, guests passed through the interview room. Mrs. Pembroke emerged flustered and indignant. Mr. Briggs came out muttering about absurd suspicion. The Ramsays appeared confused and anxious. Time wore on. Afternoon light softened toward gold, and the garden seemed to hold its breath. When Mrs. Compton finally returned from her own interview, she sank onto the bench beside Miss Marple with a sigh heavy enough to rustle the nearby rose bushes. "This is an absolute nightmare, Jane," she murmured. Inspector Gale asked whether I had any disagreements, any debts, any secrets. Me, as though I have the slightest reason to be mixed up with a dead man. "I am sure he is only being thorough," Miss Marple said. "His job requires it." Mrs. Compton shook her head, indignant even in her distress. The inspector asked if I could think of any guest who behaved unusually today, as though I had time to watch for such things. "I've been running about since morning." Miss Marple gave her a tiny, sympathetic smile. "People do show themselves at gatherings, Harriet. Small gestures, nervous glances, an eagerness to avoid attention or sometimes a little too much interest in it. Jane, if you know something—" "I know nothing yet," Miss Marple said firmly. "But I am listening." Their conversation was interrupted by the soft crunch of gravel. Inspector Gale approached with a focused expression. "Miss Marple," he said, "might I have a word?" Mrs. Compton looked startled, but Gale did not reassure her. Miss Marple rose, smoothing the front of her skirt, and followed the inspector a short distance away, where the hum of garden conversation became a muted backdrop. "I'd appreciate your impressions," Gale said without preamble. You see a great deal more than most people admit to noticing." Miss Marple hesitated, not out of reluctance, but to ensure she chose her words with the precision the moment required. "There are threads," she said slowly, "but they do not yet form a pattern. Emily Harper is frightened, more than a young girl should be. Mr. Briggs is unusually displeased even for him. And Dr. Littleton, well, he guards his thoughts too closely for my liking." Gale nodded. "Interesting observations." She continued, lowering her voice. "But the most curious thing, Inspector, is the man himself. A stranger comes to a garden party uninvited, leaves no explanation, and dies quietly in a small room no one watches. That suggests he intended to be unseen, or someone intended that he should be." Gale studied her for a moment. "You believe someone lured him here?" "I believe," Miss Marple said softly, "that people seldom end up in quiet rooms by accident." A shout interrupted them. The constable at the gate called, "Inspector, sir!" Gale spun around, and Miss Marple followed his gaze. Emily Harper stood at the gate, pale as chalk, her hands pressed against her mouth in horror. Beside her, the constable held out a small object, a delicate silver locket, its chain broken, its clasp smeared with something dark. Emily whispered shakily, I didn't mean to drop it. I only remembered just now. It was on the floor of the quiet room when I peeked inside. I thought it was mine at first, but it isn't. I swear it isn't." Miss Marple felt the air tighten like a drawn string. A locket found near a dead man, handed over by a trembling young woman who had been glancing toward the gate all afternoon. Another piece of the puzzle had surfaced. Small, exquisite, dangerous. And somewhere not far away, someone was beginning to realize the investigation was catching up with them. Emily's explanation tumbled out in fragile pieces, her breath catching as she spoke. "I didn't know what it was at first. I thought it was something Mrs. Compton had dropped. But then when I saw it properly just now, I realized I'd never seen it before in my life." She looked at Inspector Gale with pleading eyes. "I wasn't hiding it. Truly I wasn't. And I only remembered because someone mentioned the quiet room again." The inspector held the locket delicately between gloved fingers. Miss Marple noticed at once that it was of an older style. Filigreed silver, the hinge nearly invisible, the kind of piece that might either be a treasured heirloom or a sentimental trinket from a lover. More importantly, the smear on the clasp was not merely dirt. It had that unmistakable dull brown tint that suggested dried blood. "Did anyone see you pick it up earlier?" Gale asked Emily. No, I only stepped inside for a moment before the inspector came. The door was slightly open. I didn't go near the body. I promise I didn't." She pressed a trembling hand to her throat. "I shouldn't have touched it at all. I'm sorry." Gale's voice remained steady, but not unkind. "No one is accusing you of wrongdoing. But you must understand, Miss Harper, objects found near a deceased man tend to carry significance, even small ones." Miss Marple saw Emily flinch at that. The girl was holding something back, though whether out of fear or confusion was not yet clear. As the inspector carried the locket toward the house to examine it more closely, Miss Marple followed at a thoughtful distance. Mrs. Compton intercepted Emily, fussing over her in a half-panicked, half-maternal flurry, while the remaining guests watched with unabashed interest. Wordless speculation drifted through the garden like a sudden chill. Inside the house, Inspector Gale placed the locket on the writing desk beneath a lamp. Miss Marple joined him, her hands folded neatly before her, her expression mild but alert. "It isn't new," Gale muttered as he studied the design. "Craftsmanship's too fine to be cheap. No initials on the outside, perhaps inside." He opened it carefully. The hinge creaked faintly. Inside was a tiny faded photograph of a young woman, dark hair pinned neatly, a shy smile, the image slightly blurred at the edges with age. Opposite it, where another photograph might have been, The frame was empty. Gale frowned. Only half a pair. Miss Marple leaned slightly closer. How interesting. It suggests someone removed the second photograph recently, possibly to conceal it, but not carefully enough to account for the broken chain. A struggle, Gale proposed. Perhaps. Or haste. People often make mistakes when they are frightened. Gale shut the locket and turned it over in his hand. This belonged to someone, and if it was dropped near the body, then someone brought it into that room, either the victim himself or whoever met him there. Miss Marple nodded. The question, of course, is whether it was meant to be left behind. The inspector paused, regarding her with a curious expression. Do you think someone planted it? It is always best, Inspector, to consider all possibilities, Miss Marple said diplomatically. People, I've found, are endlessly inventive when they wish to mislead. He grunted, appreciating but not entirely liking the ambiguity. Either way, we need to know who this woman is. He tapped the faded photograph. She might be the reason Blunt came here today. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before speaking. Henry Blunt. Yes, Inspector. I believe I may have heard the name. I should like to think on it a little longer. But I believe someone in the village once mentioned it in connection with a matter of some delicacy. Gale's brows rose. Delicacy? Miss Marple smiled her gentle, unthreatening smile. Oh, such matters tend to circulate quietly, but they leave echoes. Before the inspector could press for more, the constable appeared at the doorway. Sir, Mr. Briggs is asking to speak with you again. Says it's urgent. Gale let out a weary sigh. Briggs always thinks everything is urgent. But Miss Marple's eyes brightened with subtle interest. Lionel Briggs does not often seek out authority, unless he fears authority is seeking him. Gale's expression shifted. You believe he knows more than he said? I believe, Miss Marple replied slowly, that he is a man with a naturally contrary disposition. If he wishes to speak again, something has unsettled him. That, Inspector, is worth noting. The inspector nodded sharply and stepped out to meet Briggs. Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, listening unobtrusively as they walked along the corridor toward the garden. Briggs was standing stiffly by the rose arch, his hat clutched in one hand, his jaw working as though he were chewing an invisible piece of gristle. The moment he saw the inspector, he burst out, I won't have it said that I've lied, Inspector Gale. I told you everything I knew. No one has accused you of lying, Mr. Briggs, Gale replied in a tone that suggested he was dangerously close to doing just that. But perhaps there is something you recalled? Briggs hesitated, casting a furtive glance around the garden. His eyes fell on Miss Marple, who merely smiled at him in that mild, grandmotherly way that tended to disarm even the most irritable men, and he swallowed hard. It's just, well, I didn't think it important, he muttered. But since you're making everyone stay and poking about, and since that girl there's found something, he waved vaguely toward Emily. I suppose I ought to say it. Say what? Gale pressed. Briggs lowered his voice. I saw the fellow earlier, before we found him dead. Inspector Gale stiffened. You saw Henry Blunt? Where? Near the fence at the bottom of the garden, Briggs said reluctantly. He was speaking to someone. Someone? Gale repeated. Who? I couldn't see properly, Briggs snapped, growing defensive. I was coming from the lane. They were half hidden behind the lilacs. Only saw a figure. Might have been a woman from the way she moved. I couldn't swear to it. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. A woman? She asked gently. Briggs nodded, still frowning. Yes, I think so. Could have been young or slight. Not many men move like that. They were talking quietly, looked heated like they was arguing. Then I heard Mrs. Compton call for the musicians, so I walked off. Didn't think any more of it. Inspector Gale's face hardened. And you didn't consider this relevant when I asked if you'd seen anything unusual? Well, I didn't know he was dead then, did I? Briggs shot back. And strangers wander through gardens all the time during these blasted parties. Not into quiet rooms, they don't, Gale responded curtly. Miss Marple watched Briggs's discomfort carefully. He was telling the truth, or as much of it as he wished to. But something about the way he described the second figure tugged at her attention. A slight woman, a heated conversation, near the fence. Her eyes drifted toward Emily Harper, who stood with her friends but looked far too pale, far too withdrawn for a girl simply rattled by an afternoon misfortune. Then to Mrs. Pembroke, who hovered like an anxious sparrow near the tea table. And then, finally, to Mrs. Ramsay, whose gaze was fixed firmly on her husband, though her fingers toyed ceaselessly with the clasp of her handbag. So many possibilities. But one detail caught Miss Marple's mind like a burr, the hidden photograph in the locket and the missing second image. Two people connected. One image removed. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, drawing Gale's attention, "I think it would be wise to ask Mr. near Briggs precisely when this conversation took place." Briggs frowned. "I told you before the music started." "But the musicians arrived early today," Miss Marple reminded him gently. "Earlier than Mrs. Compton expected. So, Mr. Briggs, if you could recall whether the sun was fully out, or whether the shadows had begun to fall, it might help establish how long Mr. Blunt was alive after you saw him." Briggs blinked, clearly thrown by the precision. "Well, now that you mention it, the shadows had just started stretching. The sun was going low. Must have been, 3:30? 3:45? Miss Marple nodded slowly. That meant Henry Blunt had been alive only a short time before Daphne discovered him. Too short for coincidence. Someone had met him. Someone had argued, and someone had ensured he never left the quiet room again. Gale absorbed this silently, then turned to Miss Marple. "Do you believe this woman is our killer?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting with serene calm. "I believe, Inspector, that people often meet in gardens for reasons they would not wish to put in writing, and that secrets have a way of leading to very unfortunate consequences." She looked up, blue eyes clear as glass. "And I believe the woman Mr. Briggs saw did not come to this garden to enjoy the roses." Inspector Gale dismissed Briggs with instructions to remain nearby, and the man retreated with visible relief, though not without casting a suspicious look over his shoulder. The moment he was out of earshot, Gale exhaled a long breath, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Miss Marple could see the gears turning, like an unidentified woman meeting Henry Blunt before his death. This shifted the timeline, narrowed the opportunity, and introduced a motive yet unknown. "Miss Marple," Gale said quietly, "I can't tell whether Briggs is more nervous because he's hiding something, or because he thinks we'll assume he is." "That," Miss Marple replied in her calm, unhurried way, "is often the trouble with men who consider themselves perpetually wronged. Their irritation obscures guilt and innocence alike." Gale gave her a thin, tired smile. Very true. His attention drifted toward the locket still resting in his hand. "This woman, whoever she is, may be the key. But I don't suppose you recognized her from the photograph." Miss Marple shook her head, though thoughtfully. "No, it is too old, too faded. But photographs travel, you know. They change hands. They are kept long after people leave our immediate lives." Gale nodded, though he seemed unconvinced. He tucked the locket safely into an envelope as Daphne approached, wringing her apron again. "Begging your pardon, sir," she said timidly, "but Mrs. Compton says the guests are starting to get restless. Some of them are asking if they mightn't go home." Gale shook his head. "Not yet. They'll have to wait a bit longer." Daphne nodded but bit her lip. "It's just, they're starting to whisper things, sir. They're whispering a lot." Miss Marple gave her a comforting look. "People do whisper, Daphne. It is their way of comforting themselves when the truth feels too large." Daphne managed a small, uneasy smile before hurrying back. As the inspector turned to resume interviews, Miss Marple walked the perimeter of the garden. She preferred to observe quietly, unnoticed. Roses bowed their delicate heads in the late afternoon light, and the shadows had lengthened. Briggs had been truthful in that detail at least. She traced the path he might have taken when he saw Henry Blunt with a woman partly obscured behind the lilacs. The lilac bushes rustled softly in the breeze. Miss Marple paused, touching one of the branches. The leaves bore a few faint marks, scratches where fabric or jewelry might have snagged. Nothing conclusive, but suggestive. A soft voice behind her made her turn. Mrs. Ramsay stood there, clutching her handbag with unusual tightness. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you privately?" Miss Marple gave a mild nod. "Of course, my dear." They moved a few steps away, though Mrs. Ramsay remained tense, so her gaze sweeping the garden as if expecting someone to overhear. "I don't want to go to the inspector," she began, her voice trembling, "because it will all sound so silly. But well, something happened earlier, and now I wonder if it means something, or if it was just coincidence." "Coincidence," Miss Marple said gently, "is a word people use when they wish to stop themselves from asking further questions." Mrs. Ramsay swallowed. "It was before the party began. I came early to help Harriet with the table settings. When I arrived, I saw a man standing by the side gate, just standing there, as though he were waiting. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but, well, now I wonder." "Did you recognize him?" "I can't say for certain, but I believe—" She hesitated, then lowered her voice further. "So I believe it was the same man who's in the quiet room." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And did he see you, Mrs. Ramsay?" "Oh, yes. He looked right at me. He seemed startled, almost as if he hadn't expected anyone. Then he turned away and pretended to adjust his cuff." "Did he go into the house afterward?" "No. At least, I didn't see him. He may have walked around the garden. I went inside to find Harriet." Miss Marple considered this. "Did he appear anxious or determined?" Mrs. Ramsay pressed her fingers to her brow. "Both, perhaps. I didn't stay long enough to be sure." Her husband called to her then, and she excused herself hastily. Miss Marple watched her retreat, pondering the implications. Henry Blunt had arrived early. He had lingered by the side gate. He had met a woman by the lilacs. And soon after, he had died in the quiet room. Too many meetings for a man supposedly unknown to everyone present. Miss Marple wandered back to the garden table where Dr. Littleton had resumed his glass of wine. He regarded her with a faint, irritated curiosity. "You look as though you're cataloguing every leaf and footprint," he said dryly. "Not at all," Miss Marple said. "I was simply thinking how very interesting the layout of Mrs. Compton's garden is. People forget how clearly one can see the side gate from the kitchen window." Littleton stiffened, just slightly. "I shouldn't know. I never look out that way." "No, but you often arrive early for Mrs. Compton's gatherings, don't you, to help her carry things?" He gave a curt laugh. "I arrive early to avoid the crowd, Miss Marple. Nothing more. For Harriet fusses terribly." Miss Marple's needles clicked again as she resumed her knitting. "Yes, she does fuss. And I dare say she'd have noticed if a stranger were loitering at her gate." Littleton looked as though he might respond, but Inspector Gale approached again, interrupting them. "Miss Marple," Gale said reluctantly, "I'm afraid I must ask for your help once more. There's something I'd like your opinion on." She rose, tucking her knitting neatly into her bag. "I shall be glad to be of assistance, Inspector." He led her toward the writing room where Emily Harper sat alone, pale and trembling, her hands clasped tightly. Emily looked up as they entered, eyes wide as a cornered animal's. "Miss Harper," Gale said evenly, "there is something you haven't told us. Something about the locket, or about the man in the quiet room." Emily's throat bobbed. I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice soft as warm linen. "Emily, my dear, you looked frightened long before Daphne found the body. You have been glancing toward the gate all afternoon, and now this locket appears. It would be best, for yourself and everyone else, if you explained what is troubling you." For a moment, Emily said nothing. Tears welled in her eyes, clinging to her lashes. Then, in a trembling whisper, "I knew the woman in the photograph." The room froze around them, the faint ticking of the mantel clock suddenly sharp enough to cut the air. Inspector Gale leaned forward. "Who is she?" Emily wiped her cheek with shaking fingers. "Her name was Clara Blunt, Henry Blunt's wife." Miss Marple felt a quiet, inevitable click in her mind, the first shape of a pattern emerging from chaos. Emily drew a shaky breath. "And she died 3 years ago, under very strange circumstances." Emily's confession hovered in the air, fragile yet irrevocable. Inspector Gale leaned forward, his expression sharpening as though he had stepped onto firmer ground in the fog. "Strange circumstances?" he repeated carefully. "You must explain that, Miss Harper." Emily's fingers twisted together until her knuckles blanched. "I only know what I overheard. I shouldn't have been listening, but I couldn't help it. Clara Blunt was once a companion to Mrs. Weatherby. You know, the Colonel's widow who lived here before she moved to Bath. My aunt was her housekeeper. Clara used to come to tea sometimes when I visited my aunt. She was sweet, quiet, soft-spoken. She always seemed frightened of something she never named." Miss Marple felt a small, sinking ache at that. Fear held in silence often meant the person feared someone close. Inspector Gale nodded for Emily to continue. "One summer, Clara stopped coming. My aunt said she'd taken ill. Then one day she told me Clara had died. An accident, supposedly, a fall down the stairs of her home in London, but my aunt didn't believe it. She said Clara had been trying to get away from her husband. She said," Emily's voice dropped to a whisper, "that she feared him." The inspector absorbed this with a grim tightening of his jaw. "You're saying Henry Blunt may have harmed his wife?" Emily shook her head quickly. "I don't know that. I swear I don't. I only overheard my aunt speculating. But I believed Clara. Something was wrong. She was so sad those last months." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the girl's trembling arm. "And when you saw the photograph in the locket?" Emily nodded, tears gathering. "I recognized Clara at once. I panicked. I couldn't imagine what it meant, that the man who died here today was her husband. And that locket, Clara always wore one just like it. She said it was a wedding gift." Inspector Gale frowned, glancing at the sealed envelope containing the jewelry. "If this belonged to Clara, then why was it found at the scene of her husband's death?" Emily hesitated, then whispered, "Unless someone wanted him to remember her." Miss Marple's eyes softened with thought. Or to link his death to her memory, to suggest motive, to shift suspicion. Emily looked up at her, startled. "Shift it? To whom?" "That," Miss Marple said gently. "So it depends on who placed the locket there." Gale straightened, turning the new information over in his mind. "Did you ever meet Henry Blunt yourself?" "No. Auntie said Clara never introduced him. She once said he wouldn't have liked her having friends in the village." Miss Marple's expression grew very still. "Controlling husbands are not new in human history." Gale gave her a brief glance before addressing Emily again. "And you're certain Clara's death was considered an accident?" Emily nodded. "Yes. It was all formal. Newspaper notice, everything. But Auntie said—" She said Clara had been trying to leave, and then she died before she could. Silence followed, heavy with implication. Gale stood abruptly, his chair scraping. "I'll need your aunt's name and address, and any letters you may have kept." Emily's panic flared again. "Inspector, please, I don't know if I'm remembering everything correctly. I was only 17, and my aunt is gone now. She passed last winter." Gale's expression tightened. Miss Marple intervened softly. Then Emily has already told us everything she can, and she has done so bravely. Emily looked at her with grateful, watery eyes. The inspector hesitated, then gave a curt nod. Very well. Miss Harper, remain on the premises. I may have further questions later. Emily was led back out to the garden, where Mrs. Compton hastened toward her with another flurry of anxious fussing. When the door closed, Gale released a slow exhale. This complicates matters. Miss Marple folded her hands serenely. All murders do, Inspector. Human nature is seldom tidy. But this, if Blunt harmed his wife, someone connected to her might hold a grudge. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Quite possibly. Grudges left to ferment can be most potent things. And yet, Gale continued, pacing the small room, this still doesn't explain why Blunt came here. Why little Bracknell? Why this party? He wasn't invited. No one has admitted to knowing him. Oh, Miss Marple said quietly. People rarely admit such things immediately, especially when the connection is not flattering. Gale shot her a frustrated glance. Meaning? Meaning, Miss Marple said gently, that someone here knew he would come. Someone who arranged to meet him. Someone who likely wished Clara had lived a happier life, or perhaps resented the man for reasons entirely separate. Gale froze mid-pace. And was that person the woman Briggs saw? Miss Marple gave a faint, the enigmatic tilt of her head. It seems, she murmured, more and more likely. Gale's gaze flicked toward the garden. We need to identify her. Indeed, Miss Marple said. You might begin with the women who have been unusually quiet, or unusually eager to appear calm. The inspector raised an eyebrow, a rather broad category. True, Miss Marple admitted, but if you watch closely, people will sort themselves. Before Gale could respond, the door opened, and Mrs. Ramsay stepped in, her face pale, her composure fraying. Inspector, may I speak with you? It's about my husband. Gale motioned her in at once. Miss Marple stepped aside, pretending polite disinterest while listening intently. Mrs. Ramsay clutched her handbag as though it were a lifeline. My husband left the garden for a few minutes earlier, just after the musicians arrived. He told me he needed air, but he came back flustered. I didn't think anything of it until now. Are you saying he might have seen something? Gale asked. I don't know, but he's been tense since we arrived today. And when you said no one could leave, he seemed frightened. Gale's jaw tightened. Where is he now? Mrs. Ramsay's eyes flicked toward the French doors. Over by the rose trellis. He said he needed to sit down. The inspector moved to leave, but Miss Marple's soft voice halted him. Inspector, a moment. Gale paused, impatient yet trusting. Miss Marple's eyes held a gentle warning. Be delicate with Mr. Ramsay. Men who fear scandal often shut down entirely when confronted too sharply. Gale nodded curtly, then left the room with brisk determination. Miss Marple lingered behind, considering Mrs. Ramsay carefully, as the woman looked genuinely distressed. But distress did not exclude complication. Miss Marple had known many women whose husbands' secrets weighed heavily on them, even when they themselves had nothing to hide. Mrs. Ramsay, she asked softly once they were alone, did you ever meet Clara Blunt? Mrs. Ramsay's eyes widened. Clara? Yes, once. At the Weatherbys. She was lovely, rather nervous. I always felt she wanted to say something she couldn't. And your husband? Mrs. Ramsay hesitated, a fraction too long. He met her only briefly. I don't believe they ever spoke more than a few words. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know when a woman lied to protect someone she loved, or feared. Gale's voice drifted distantly from the garden, raised in firm inquiry. A deeper murmur followed. Mr. Ramsay's voice, trembling slightly. Mrs.? Ramsay wrung her hands. Miss Marple, I'm scared. Miss Marple touched her arm gently. Fear is natural, my dear, but truth is sometimes the only safe harbor. Mrs. Ramsay shook her head helplessly. I don't know the truth. That's what frightens me. Miss Marple's gaze drifted out the window. Beyond the trellis, Mr. Ramsay had risen from the bench, gesturing anxiously as Gale questioned him. His shoulders hunched, his eyes darted. A guilty man or a frightened one forced too near his own secrets. Miss Marple watched quietly, her mind stitching threads together. Henry Blunt. Clara Blunt. A locket, a woman by the lilacs. A frightened girl. A nervous doctor. A husband who left the garden. A wife who shielded her fear with carefully chosen words. Too many pieces for chance. And the pattern, though faint, was beginning to take shape. She could feel it. But the next revelation, she knew, would not come from words. It would come from an action someone was about to take. Someone who believed the noose of discovery was drawing a little too close. Mr. Ramsay's voice, muffled by distance yet sharp with strain, carried faintly across the garden. Miss Marple watched as Inspector Gale questioned him, the man's hands twitching at his sides, his eyes darting everywhere except the inspector's face. Mrs. Ramsay hovered anxiously near the French doors, fingers pressed to her lips. She looked as though she might crumble if her husband so much as raised his voice. Miss Marple's gaze followed the faint tremor in the rose branches behind them. Someone else was listening, perhaps several someones. From whispered speculation had grown into a hum that spread through the garden like a restless hive. The guests were trying to behave normally, of course. Discreet English propriety demanded as much, but every movement now had a brittle edge. Even the afternoon light seemed sharper, the warmth fading into something metallic. Inspector Gale finally stepped back from Mr. Ramsay with a clipped nod. Ramsay, pale and sweating, lowered himself onto the bench behind him as though his legs barely held. Gale approached Miss Marple, looking troubled. He says he left the garden around 3:30, Gale murmured quietly. Claims he only walked to the lane and back. Says he never saw Blunt or anyone else. Miss Marple watched Ramsay carefully. His hands trembled uncontrollably, but his gaze was fixed downward, and was though he dared not look at his wife or anyone else. And you do not believe him, she said softly. Gale exhaled. No, he's hiding something. But whether it's related to the murder or something else entirely, I can't yet say. Miss Marple nodded. People tell partial truths when they fear the entire one. And fear, Inspector, is often our most revealing clue. Before Gale could respond, Mrs. Pembroke's shrill voice sliced through the tension. Inspector! Inspector Gale! Someone is missing! Every head turned. Mrs. Pembroke, flustered and rosy-cheeked from both heat and excitement, flapped toward them like a ruffled hen. Missing? Gale repeated, tone brisk but wary. Who? Emily Hopper! Mrs. Pembroke exclaimed triumphantly, as though she had discovered a priceless treasure instead of a frightened young woman's absence. She was just there near the tea table, and now she's nowhere to be seen. I've looked everywhere. Mrs. Compton gasped, nearly spilling her sherry. Emily! Oh, heavens, the poor dear. She must be overwhelmed or fainted somewhere. Inspector Gale's stern composure snapped to alert focus. Sergeant, he called toward the constable at the gate. Search the perimeter. No one leaves without my say-so. Miss Marple's expression tightened. Emily Harper's sudden disappearance was no coincidence. Fear, guilt, or danger, one of the three had driven her away. And given Emily's earlier trembling and the frightened glances, Miss Marple suspected the girl had finally reached the breaking point of whatever secret she carried. Inspector, Miss Marple said quietly, I think I know where she might have gone. Gale turned sharply to her. Where? Not far, Miss Marple replied, lifting her gaze toward the gravel path leading to the quiet room. Fear drives people back to the beginning, where the trouble first found them. Gale wasted no time. Together, he and Miss Marple followed the narrow path, the air growing still as they neared the small annex. The door, which had been firmly closed earlier, now hung slightly ajar. They exchanged a brief glance before Gale pushed it open. Inside, Emily Harper stood with her back toward them. Her shoulders heaved with uneven breaths, and her hands pressed against the small table where the folded napkins remained. The body of Henry Blunt had been removed, but the room still carried the heavy imprint of death, a stillness that clung to the walls. "Emily," Miss Marple said softly. "My dear child." Emily stiffened. When she turned around, her face was streaked with tears. Her eyes were enormous, haunted. She looked not merely frightened, but trapped. "I didn't run away," she whispered brokenly. I needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere I could think." Inspector Gale stepped forward. "Miss Harper, you must understand that disappearing in the middle of an investigation is dangerous. People will assume the worst." Emily gave a strangled laugh. "Don't you see? The worst has already happened." She lifted shaking fingers toward the table. A small, crumpled letter lay there, something she had evidently pulled from her pocket. "He wrote to me." Miss Marple's brows rose ever so slightly. "Henry Blunt?" Emily nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't tell you, I couldn't tell you, but he wrote to me 3 days ago. He said he knew I'd known his wife. He said he needed to talk. And he asked me, begged me, to meet him today." Inspector Gale stiffened. "Why didn't you say this earlier?" Emily's eyes filled again. "Because I didn't come to meet him. I was too afraid. When Auntie died last winter, I found a letter from Clara hidden among her things. She said she feared Henry more than anyone knew. She said if anything happened to her, it wouldn't be an accident." Her breath caught. "And then Henry himself contacted me. I thought he might know Auntie suspected something. I thought he might blame me, hurt me. I didn't reply. I thought if I ignored him, he'd go away." Miss Marple approached gently, her voice calm, compassionate. "But he did not go away. He came here instead." Emily nodded, tears sliding freely. "And now he's dead. Don't you see? Someone must think I met him, or someone must think I wanted revenge." She shuddered. "Or worse, someone might want it to look like I did." Inspector Gale picked up the letter from the table, scanning it quickly. His face darkened. "This is indeed from Blunt. He mentions Clara. Says he wishes to set matters right." Cryptic, but clear enough to imply some past wrong. He lowered the paper. "If you had shown me this earlier, Miss Harper, it would have saved much confusion." "I was terrified," she whispered. "I still am." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on Emily's trembling arm. "My dear, fear clouds judgment, but you did the right thing in telling us now." Gale exhaled. "For now, you'll remain with Mrs. Compton. No wandering off again. I need to ensure your safety." Emily managed a faint nod before Gale escorted her back toward the main house. Now Miss Marple lingered a moment longer in the quiet room, looking at the space where Blunt's body had lain. The afternoon light slanted in through the curtains, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. Slow, delicate, unbothered. But beneath that gentle glow, something else tugged at her attention. A scent, faint, sharp, out of place, lemon verbena, a perfume not worn by Emily Harper nor by Mrs. Compton, not by any young woman she had seen today, but by someone older, someone elegant, someone who wished to conceal strength beneath softness. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Someone else had been in this room recently, and they had stood close enough to the body for their perfume to cling to the air. She stepped out into the garden, the soft breeze brushing her cheek, and watched the guests from a distance. But one of them wore lemon verbena. One of them had reason to meet Henry Blunt. One of them had been near the lilacs. One of them had something to lose. And one of them, she suspected, was realizing Miss Marple had just discovered the subtlest thread of all. Miss Marple stepped back into the garden with the quiet composure that so often concealed the swift, sharp movements of her mind. The lingering trace of lemon verbena clung faintly to her senses, a scent lightly floral, slightly citrus, unmistakably refined. It belonged to someone who cared how she was perceived, someone who understood the subtle power of fragrance in social environments. Miss Marple had always found scent telling. It lingered when words did not. The guests had not dispersed far during Emily's brief disappearance. In fact, if anything, they had clustered more tightly, drawn together by mutual unease. A few glanced toward Miss Marple as she returned, but most gazed over their shoulders with quick, darting eyes, like birds unsettled by a distant predator they could not yet see. Mrs. Pembroke was whispering rather too loudly to Mrs. Greeley, her voice thick with the pleasure of her own speculation. "I always said that girl was too quiet. It's the quiet ones, you know. They bottle things up. And then, well, eventually something dreadful happens." Mrs. Greeley nodded sagely, as though she herself had once been nearly murdered by an overly silent acquaintance. Meanwhile, Dr. Littleton stood near the drinks table, pouring himself another small measure of sherry with a hand that trembled only faintly. His jaw was rigid, tense. He stared at the amber liquid as though hoping truth lay somewhere in its reflection. Here the Ramsays sat apart. Mrs. Ramsay clasped her husband's hand as though holding him to the earth by sheer force, while Mr. Ramsay hunched inward, avoiding every gaze. But one figure, in particular, held Miss Marple's quiet attention. Mrs. Hargreaves, plump, well-dressed, with a fondness for old-fashioned finery, stood beneath the shade of a copper beech tree. Her expression was composed, almost serene, her hands folded neatly in front of her. But Miss Marple's experienced eye missed little. Beneath the calm facade, Mrs. Hargreaves's gaze flickered from guest to guest with quick, calculating precision. And as a gentle breeze stirred the garden, the faintest trace reached Miss Marple once more. Lemon verbena. Not strong, not overt. A fragrance meant to suggest delicacy rather than announce presence. Miss Marple did not react outwardly. Instead, she reached into her knitting bag and drew out her needles, letting them click in a soft, rhythmic dance. That familiar motion served two purposes. It soothed people into underestimating her, and it helped her think. Inspector Gale reappeared from the house, looking more strained than before. He approached Miss Marple with a purposeful stride. "Emily's letter adds a new dimension," he murmured. "I'll need handwriting analysis, a deeper look into Henry Blunt's history, and, frankly, a longer list of motives than I'd anticipated." "You will have them," Miss Marple assured him gently. "But sometimes the truth lies not in formal records, but in the small behaviors people hope will go unnoticed." Gale's eyes narrowed. "You've seen something." Miss Marple's smile was mild. "I've seen many things, but as to what is significant, well, that is what we must determine." Before Gale could question her further, a sharp cry erupted near the refreshments table. Mrs. Compton stood beside it, her hand pressed dramatically to her chest. "My silver cake knife," she exclaimed. "The one with the mother-of-pearl handle. It's gone." There was an immediate flurry of gasps. The missing knife, a valuable piece, often displayed on special occasions, added a fresh ripple of unease through the gathering. Inspector Gale strode forward. "When did you last see it, Mrs. Compton?" "Just before the guests arrived," she said, wringing her hands. "I laid it beside the sponge cake, but, oh dear, perhaps someone moved it." Miss Marple stepped forward quietly. "Harriet, you always set the knife at precisely the same angle. If it is not there now, so someone took it deliberately." Inspector Gale shot her a quick look. "Deliberately? Why?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. Because a cake knife, Inspector, is sharp enough to wound, but common enough to move without drawing notice. A brief, tense silence followed. Gale inhaled slowly. We must search the grounds. At once, the constable began directing guests to remain where they were. Gale and Miss Marple walked toward the trellis, the inspector scanning the grass for any sign of something discarded or hidden. Miss Marple bent down near the lilac bushes, the very spot where Briggs had seen Henry Blunt speaking to a woman. Her fingers brushed the soil lightly, examining the ground with an unobtrusive glance. A faint indentation, two in fact, suggested the heel of a shoe had turned sharply here, as though someone had pivoted in haste, and something else glinted beneath a leaf. Miss Marple gently retrieved it, a single pearl button. She turned it delicately between her fingers. Dropped, she murmured, in a moment of agitation, perhaps. Inspector Gale joined her. What is that? Off a dress? Or a glove, she suggested. Some more formal gloves are fastened with such buttons. Women's gloves. Miss Marple nodded. From someone who still values old-fashioned elegance? Gale straightened, scanning the garden. That narrows the field considerably. Miss Marple did not say whom she had in mind. Not yet. They continued searching until they returned once more to the garden's center. Mrs. Compton fussed anxiously near the dessert table, while Mrs. Hargreaves adjusted the cuffs of her pale dove-gray gloves, the very pair Miss Marple had recalled seeing earlier. Smooth, unmarked, except no pearl buttons. These gloves fastened with small metal hooks, practical, easy to secure. Miss Marple's eyes drifted instead to Mrs. Pembroke, whose gloves, cream-colored, delicate, did indeed bear small pearl buttons. But Mrs. Pembroke had been at the table gossiping ceaselessly all afternoon. It was unlikely she had slipped away to meet Henry Blunt. Her gaze shifted again. Mrs. Ramsay held her husband's hand tightly in both of hers. Uncovered hands. No gloves at all. And then, there, near the beech tree, quiet, composed, Mrs. Hargreaves had taken off one glove entirely. Her right hand was bare, the left still gloved. The glove removed lay tucked into her handbag. Miss Marple observed the glove more closely. 3 pearl buttons, one missing. Her heart made a soft, deliberate murmur of revelation, but she said nothing aloud. Not yet. Inspector Gale approached with a deepening frown. We didn't find the knife. That concerns me. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. I believe it should. Gale rubbed the back of his neck. Why would someone steal it unless... He broke off abruptly as a scream cut through the garden. High, sharp, genuine. Everyone froze. The sound came from the far end of the lawn. Inspector Gale and Miss Marple moved at once, weaving through startled guests who parted in alarm. At the edge of the garden, near the rose arch, Daphne stood trembling, her face ghostly pale, her eyes fixed on something low to the ground. Miss Marple reached her side first. The silver cake knife lay among the rose roots, and its blade was stained with fresh blood. The roses, innocent and fragrant, and swayed lightly in the evening breeze, while the whisper of danger deepened around them. Daphne's scream still trembled in the air when Inspector Gale pushed past the last of the onlookers and knelt beside the rose bed. The cake knife gleamed wickedly among the petals, its mother-of-pearl handle smeared with dirt, its blade darkened with fresh blood that had not yet dried. A sinister addition to a garden once meant for polite conversation and sponge cake. Don't touch it, Gale said sharply, though no one had moved. He signaled the constable, who hastened forward with an evidence cloth. Miss Marple, hands clasped neatly before her, surveyed the scene with calm but penetrating attention. She noticed the roses bending slightly, a subtle disturbance in the branches. Something or someone had pushed through them not long ago. Fresh scratches marred a few stems. A scrap of pale fabric clung to a thorn. Gale spotted it too. "What's that?" He reached with a gloved hand and plucked the scrap carefully. A small strip of soft material, cream-colored, delicate, from a fine garment or accessory. The inspector held it up. "Looks like part of a glove." A ripple of tension swept through the guests behind them. Miss Marple didn't turn, but she felt the shift in the air, the way people grew suddenly still, the way breaths drew inward and were held. She kept her gaze on the roses. "A person who pushed through these bushes must have been in considerable haste," she murmured, "and frightened, perhaps." Gale stood, his eyes narrowing as he looked over the gathering. "Someone discarded the knife here. Recently," he raised his voice. "No one leaves the garden. Not until I say so." A murmur rose among the guests. Panic, indignation, fear, but no one dared argue. Miss Marple stepped closer to the roses, her fingers hovering a respectful inch from the disturbed branches. The roses catch very easily. Even a careful person would leave a trace if they forced their way through. Gale nodded grimly, "And whoever did this may have cut themselves. There's more blood here than the knife alone accounts for." Miss Marple's eyes drifted subtly toward Mrs. Hargreaves. The woman stood near the beech tree, remarkably still, both gloves now tucked neatly into her handbag. Her posture was perfect, composed, but her complexion had taken on a faint, almost imperceptible sheen. A single bead of perspiration glistened at her temple. Her gaze was fixed, not on the knife, but on Miss Marple, and a silent recognition passed between them. Mrs. Hargreaves blinked once, slowly, then looked away. Inspector Gale, unaware of the exchange, turned to Daphne. "Did you touch anything?" Daphne shook her head vigorously. "No, sir. I was just gathering the petals like Mrs. Compton said, and then I saw it, and I screamed." Gale softened. "You did the right thing." Mrs. Compton bustled forward, distraught. "This is dreadful, simply dreadful. Blood on my roses, my roses." Miss Marple laid a calming hand on her arm. "Harriet, the roses are the least of our concerns." Mrs. Compton's eyes welled with tears, and she nodded helplessly. Inspector Gale straightened, looking at Miss Marple. "This confirms it. Blunt was murdered, and the killer is here, among these people, disposing of weapons in a panic." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, Inspector, but I fear panic may not be the only reason for this discarded knife." "What do you mean?" "It may not have been used on Mr. Blunt at all." The guests collectively inhaled. Gale stared at her. "The blood?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Fresh blood. And yet Mr. Blunt's body showed no obvious wound." She gestured delicately toward the quiet room. "Unless the inspector missed something, which I sincerely doubt, the knife was used after Mr. Blunt died." Gale's expression tightened. He considered the knife again, then the guests. "Someone else may be injured." Miss Marple nodded. "Or someone wishes us to believe they are." This new twist sent a shiver through the group. Instinctively, they looked at one another, searching for signs of a hidden wound, a bloodied cuff, a trembling hand. Mrs. Ramsay gripped her husband's arm as though trying to reassure both him and herself. Mrs. Pembroke clutched her pearls, scandalized beyond speech. Dr. Littleton stared intently at the knife, his professional instincts awakened. "We must check each guest," Gale said firmly. "No exceptions." A murmur of protest rose, but Miss Marple quietly observed, "If someone is bleeding, Inspector, they may already be in distress. They may even have tried to tend the wound." She let her gaze drift, seemingly at random, across the assembled faces. Emily, still pale, but unharmed. Mrs. Compton, fluttering, flustered, but uninjured. Daphne, shaking, but clean. The Ramsays, anxious, tightly knit. Mrs. Pembroke, self-righteous and entirely whole. Dr. Littleton, cool, alert, too intent. And Mrs. Hargreaves, her gloved hand now slipping into her handbag, eyeing too carefully, too slowly. Gale began to instruct the constable, but Miss Marple touched his arm lightly. "Inspector," she murmured, "would you indulge an old woman for just a moment, before you begin your work?" Gale blinked. What did you have in mind? Miss Marple's smile was soft, deceptively mild. Sometimes a single question opens far more doors than a dozen searches. She stepped forward into the center of the lawn. Every eye turned toward her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said in her gentle, unthreatening voice, "may I ask you something rather simple?" The garden was silent. "Which one of you," she asked quietly, "saw Clara Blunt in the days before she died?" A gasp ran through the crowd. Miss Marple continued, "Because someone here did. Someone knew her far better than they have admitted. Someone who recognized Henry Blunt the moment he stepped into this garden." Inspector Gale stared at her. "Miss Marple," she lifted a hand lightly. "And someone," she added, her gaze drifting, apparently idly, toward Mrs. Hargreaves, "who still wears the very perfume Clara favored." Mrs. Hargreaves froze. A tremor, so small most would miss it, ran through her left arm. She clutched her handbag a fraction too tightly. The roses swayed behind her, as if stirred by the faintest echo of movement. Miss Marple continued, her tone still gentle, still serene. "People forget that perfume lingers. Grief lingers too, and guilt longer still." Mrs. Hargreaves's eyes flicked toward the rose bed, toward the bloodied knife, toward the missing pearl button, and then toward the path leading away from the garden. A path she could not take. No, Inspector Gale noticed the movement. "Mrs. Hargreaves," he said sharply, "stay where you are." Her composure wavered, just for a moment. Enough to tell Miss Marple that something was about to happen, something reckless, something that would reveal far more than any question she or Inspector Gale had asked so far. The trap of truth had begun to close, and Mrs. Hargreaves, with her trembling hand and lemon verbena perfume, was standing at its very center. Mrs. Hargreaves did not move at first. She stood perfectly still beneath the copper beech, her gloved hand poised on the brim of her hat, her eyes lowered just enough to give the impression of polite confusion. But Miss Marple had watched far too many performances of dignity under strain to be deceived. The woman's posture was too rigid, her breathing too quick, and her fingers, those elegant, manicured fingers, tightened on her handbag as though anchoring her to a world that had begun to slip. Inspector Gale took a step forward. "Mrs. Hargreaves," he repeated, voice firm but not yet accusatory, "please remain where you are." She lifted her chin slightly, a brittle smile forming. "Inspector, whatever Miss Marple is implying, I assure you I have never met Clara Blunt in my life." Miss Marple's gentle expression never wavered. "No," she said softly. "You did not meet her as Mrs. Hargreaves, but I believe you met her as Mrs. Helena Grayson, your name before you remarried." A collective gasp rippled through the gathering. Mrs. Compton nearly dropped her sherry glass, catching it at the last moment with a squeak. Mrs. Hargreaves stiffened. I don't know what you're talking about." But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Miss Marple stepped closer, her knitting bag tucked neatly under her arm. "People often send their clothes to charity after losing a loved one, but perfume is intimate. Clara Blunt favored lemon verbena, quite uncommon nowadays, but still sold in a few select London shops. You wore it today, Mrs. Hargreaves, and more significantly, you wore it when you visited Little Bracknell years ago as Helena Grayson. I recall it clearly, though we were never introduced then." Mrs. Hargreaves blinked rapidly, her calm facade beginning to splinter. Miss Marple continued, her voice quiet enough that the guests leaned closer unconsciously. "You were Clara's cousin. You visited her during her unhappiest months. You tried to persuade her to leave Henry Blunt. Clara admired you greatly. She wrote as much to Emily's aunt." Emily, standing nearby, inhaled sharply. Inspector Gale frowned. Is this true, Mrs. Hargreaves? Mrs. Hargreaves' lips tightened. I may have known Clara, briefly, but that has nothing to do with— It has everything to do with this, Miss Marple interjected gently. For Clara confided in you, and she must have told you something terrible enough that you disappeared from the village soon after her death, only to return years later under a different name, a different life. The silence that followed was electric. Mrs. Hargreaves swallowed hard. Henry Blunt. Henry was a cruel man. You don't know what he was like behind closed doors? Miss Marple's voice softened. No, but Clara knew. And you knew because you saw the bruises she hid. It's why you urged her to leave him. Inspector Gale leaned forward. And her death, did you believe it was murder? Mrs. Hargreaves' eyes shimmered. I believed he pushed her, or frightened her so badly she misstepped, but the police in London were useless. They listened to him, not to me. They called it a tragic fall. Hatred, cold and sharp, surfaced briefly in her gaze. I never forgot. Miss Marple's tone remained calm. And when Henry Blunt wrote to Emily, when he came here, you must have seen him arrive. Mrs. Hargreaves closed her eyes as though each word struck her like a blow. I saw him by the side gate. I froze. After all these years, there he was, larger than life, smiling. Her voice trembled, as if Clara had never existed. Inspector Gale's expression hardened. Did you confront him? Did you speak with him near the lilacs? Yes. She exhaled shakily. I asked him why he had come. He said he wanted to lay Clara to rest at last. But his tone— She shuddered. He was gloating. He spoke of her as a burden he'd been rid of. Emily let out a broken sob. Mrs. Hargreaves continued, her voice cracking. I told him he had no right to come back into our lives. He said he'd come to see someone who owed him, someone here. Her eyes flicked meaningfully across the garden. I don't know who. Inspector Gale pressed. And then what happened? He walked away. Mrs. Hargreaves rubbed her arms as though cold. Said he'd find who he came for. I panicked. I followed him at a distance. He went toward the quiet room. I saw him slip inside. And you? Gale asked. I stopped near the door. I thought if he came out again, I'd force him to tell me what he meant. But he never came out. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Because he was already dead. Mrs. Hargreaves's gaze flickered to the roses, to the bloodied knife. I swear I didn't kill him. I was furious, but I didn't lay a hand on him. I left the quiet room doorway when I heard footsteps. I thought it might be a guest, and I couldn't be seen so distressed. Inspector Gale folded his arms. Then how do you explain the knife? Or the blood? Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated too long. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice gentle. You cut yourself. The woman's eyes widened. You pushed through the roses in haste, Miss Marple said. Perhaps after hearing a sound, something that made you turn back. You snagged your glove. A pearl button dropped, and you cut your hand on a thorn. She gestured toward the roses. Ours, there are droplets of blood on the lower leaves. Small ones. Mrs. Hargreaves' hand flew instinctively to her handbag. Please, Miss Marple said softly. May I see your gloves? Inspector Gale tensed. The guests fell silent. With trembling fingers, Mrs. Hargreaves pulled the gloves from her handbag and handed them over. The right glove was pristine. The left bore a small tear near the wrist, and on the inside lining, a faint, unmistakable stain of blood. Mrs. Hargreaves crumpled. Not dramatically, but with the slow collapse of someone whose last defense had slipped away. She covered her face with shaking hands. So yes, she whispered. I cut myself. I was terrified someone would think I'd killed him. I found the cake knife on the table when I went to fetch a cloth for my hand. I panicked. I didn't want anyone to see blood on me, and I dropped the knife in the roses because I didn't know what else to do. Inspector Gale examined the glove closely, then looked at Miss Marple. "Which means," he said slowly, "the knife wasn't used to kill Henry Blunt." "No," Miss Marple replied softly. "It was panic, not murder, that hid the knife." Mrs. Hargreaves' grief spilled over in a broken sob. "I hated him, but I didn't kill him. I wanted him to face justice, not die unseen in a garden." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her arm. "I believe you, and the evidence does as well." Inspector Gale exhaled. "If Mrs. Hargreaves isn't our killer, then who—" Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the quiet room. "Someone else went inside after Henry Blunt," she said softly. "Someone who feared what he had come to reveal. Someone with far more to lose." Her gaze swept across the garden, across tense faces, pale throats, hands clutching glasses too tightly. Someone here knew exactly why Henry Blunt had traveled to Little Bracknell, and Miss Marple, with her calm, perceptive eyes, had already begun to see who that someone must be. Miss Marple observed the gathered guests with the serene composure of one who had spent a lifetime watching truth attempt, often awkwardly, to conceal itself behind human behavior. Mrs. Hargreaves' confession had narrowed the field, but it had not solved the crime. Her fear had driven her to foolish decisions, but her glove and the pattern of blood told only a story of panic, not violence. Inspector Gale turned to Miss Marple, a mixture of frustration and reliance in his expression. If Mrs. Hargreaves didn't kill him, then who did? Their Blunt must have met someone else after she left. Someone who entered the quiet room with him. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Someone who expected him. Someone he came here to see." Emily Harper stepped closer, trembling. He said in his letter that someone here owed him. But I don't know who." Miss Marple touched her hand gently. "You wouldn't, my dear. But someone here certainly does." Her eyes drifted toward Dr. Littleton. The doctor, who had remained curiously silent since the knife's discovery, was now standing very still. Too still. His jaw worked tightly, and the hand that held his empty wine glass trembled just enough for Miss Marple to notice. "Dr. Littleton," she said pleasantly, "you mentioned earlier that you had seen unhappy ends. But I wonder if you have also caused one." The doctor stiffened, the outrage flickering across his face. But beneath it, fear. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Marple." "Oh, not an accusation," she replied gently. "Merely a thought. You see, you arrived at Mrs. Compton's party earlier than most. Earlier, in fact, than you usually do. Mrs. Compton mentioned you helped her fetch glasses from the quiet room pantry. Yet Daphne said no such glasses were there. And then there is the matter of the lemon verbena." Gale frowned. "I thought that was Mrs. Hargreaves's perfume." "It is," Miss Marple replied. "But the quiet room held another trace beneath it. Something sharper, a medicinal note, disinfectant to be precise. Quite faint, but unmistakable in enclosed spaces." She turned to Littleton. "The scent often clings to a doctor's hands." Littleton's face paled. Miss Marple went on. "Mr. Blunt was found with no obvious wound, but that tells us very little about what killed him. A doctor, particularly one with access to certain substances, does not require a knife." Inspector Gale's eyes widened slightly. "Poison," Miss Marple nodded. "A fast-acting one, perhaps slipped into his drink or administered in a small dose. The quiet room would provide privacy, and Mr. Blunt, unwell or dizzy, might not have resisted before collapsing." Emily gasped. "But why? Why would Dr. Littleton kill him?" Miss Marple regarded the doctor kindly, as though giving him one last chance to speak the truth. "3 years ago, you were practicing in London, near the Blunts' residence. Clara visited you, did she not? Seeking help. Quietly, discreetly. She trusted you with her fears about her husband." Littleton's mouth opened, then closed. "You cared for her," Miss Marple said softly. "Deeply. And when she died, When Henry claimed it was an accident, you knew he was lying, yet you had no proof, only your grief. A shudder ran through the doctor. You know nothing of what Clara suffered. Oh, but I know her type, Miss Marple said gently. A gentle soul, too frightened to leave, too alone to defend herself, and I know your type as well. A man who believes he can fix what life has broken until the breaking becomes too great. Littleton's shoulders sagged. Miss Marple stepped closer. And then Henry Blunt arrived here today. Perhaps he came to extract money, perhaps to blackmail someone Clara confided in, or perhaps simply to boast of his new freedom. Whatever the reason, he came to remind you of your failure to save her. Inspector Gale's voice hardened. So you followed him? Yes, Miss Marple said softly, into the quiet room where no one would see. The doctor put a hand to his forehead, his composure slowly crumbling. He laughed, he whispered. He said Clara was weak, that she deserved what she got. Mrs. Ramsay let out a horrified cry. I only meant to frighten him, Littleton continued, voice trembling, to give him a dose that would make him collapse, make him think he was having a heart attack, to repay him in terror some small part of what he gave Clara. But venom, Miss Marple said quietly, has a way of striking harder than intended, and fear clouds judgment. You gave him too much. Littleton broke. He dropped to the garden bench, head in his hands, the weight of years of guilt and grief finally crushing him. I didn't want him dead. I only wanted Clara's voice to be heard. Inspector Gale motioned to the constable. Take him into custody. Quietly. As Littleton was led away, the guests remained frozen, their whispers stilled by shock, the garden heavy with sorrow. Miss Marple watched with profound sadness, not for the crime, but for the years of pain that had led to it. Human hearts, she knew, wore grooves deeper than any forensic mark. Mrs. Compton approached tentatively. Miss Marple, it's all so dreadful. Yes, Harriet, she replied softly. It is always dreadful when the truth arrives. Too late for some, too soon for others. Emily stepped forward, eyes wet. Thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing the truth when none of us could. The old woman smiled faintly. I merely listen, my dear, so people reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. As the guests slowly dispersed, subdued and thoughtful, Miss Marple retrieved her knitting from her bag and took a seat beneath the parasol. Her needles clicked softly, steadily. The village would talk for weeks, then months, perhaps years. But for now, quiet returned to the garden, though not the same quiet it had known before. Inspector Gale paused beside her. You know, he said, you make my work both easier and harder. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, nonsense, Inspector. I merely observe patterns. Patterns, he repeated wryly, that lead straight to murderers. She resumed knitting. Human nature, Inspector, is the most revealing pattern of all. And as the sun dipped low over Little Bracknell, Miss Marple knitted peacefully, not reflecting, as she often did, on the frailty of secrets, the weight of grief, and the tragic ways people sometimes sought to right wrongs they could not bear to leave untouched.